Production support for In Focus is provided by Hoosier Energy, providing electricity for Central and Southern Indiana electric cooperatives and their member customers. Information at hepn.com, and by viewers like you. Thank you.
This year, Hoosiers saw gas prices rise higher than ever before. Highways and streets dominate the scope of the state's transportation infrastructure, but that has not stopped Indiana residents from asking what their options might be moving forward. Tonight, we'll discuss the possibility of alternatives, whether the state can't afford them, and how or when they could be implemented as we put transportation in focus. Thanks for joining us for this edition of In Focus. I'm Stan Jastrzebski. If you have questions for one of our studio experts during tonight's program, please email them to us at infocus@indiana.edu or call us at 1-800-987-9848. A disruption in a pipeline that carries nearly 600,000 barrels of crude oil to the Midwest every day helped contribute earlier this year to the highest gas prices Indiana has ever seen. While some ditched their automobiles and explored other options, still others had little recourse.
2 days a week, Terre Haute resident Jim Wallace commutes 75 miles each way to Mattoon, Illinois, where he spent the past 5 years as an adjunct astronomy professor at Lakeland College.
I have no choice. It's hard to get a job here in this region as faculty because the colleges here aren't really hiring, so we go where the jobs are.
Wallace has continued to make the trip despite record-breaking national gas price averages in 2008, as well as Indiana's record gas price averages, which topped out at $4.25 a gallon on May 4th of this year.
And I've had no cost of living increase, so that's money I have to absorb that comes out of my budget for things like electricity and food and, you know, the simple things.
AAA Hoosier Motor Club spokesperson Greg Sider says many people have become desensitized to high gas prices.
They're certainly a lot higher than people would like to see right now, but that having been said, I think people are still going to be driving.
96% of all the money that's spent on transportation in the state of Indiana goes into streets and highways. But the state is beginning to look into alternative forms of transportation. INDOT has been reaching out to the public as it develops a new rail plan. Currently, INDOT regulates nearly 4,500 rail miles in Indiana, but few are dedicated to passenger travel. Indiana Transportation Association Executive Director Kent McDaniel says it's critical for Indiana to start investing in passenger rail expansions.
It would take an enormous amount of money, but it takes an enormous amount of money to build highways. It takes an enormous amount of money to build parking garages. We need to change the way we look at the world because the world is changing.
In the past, Indiana's public transit systems have relied on dedicated funding sources received through state sales tax revenues. However, because of budget shortfalls, this year's state legislature was forced to make the tough decision to eliminate that foundation. The Bloomington Transit Authority, one of Indiana's 67 public transportation systems and one of the largest in the state, serves more than 3 million riders every year.
In just a 10-year period, we've tripled our ridership on Bloomington Transit, so more and more people are using public transportation. That's a great thing for the Bloomington community as we're able to hopefully get more cars off of the street and just make Bloomington a more livable place.
Some speculate gas prices could reach the $5 mark later this year. May says he hopes if prices do go that high, people will seriously consider automobile alternatives.
If we reach those kind of levels, I think that'll be a catalyst to our elected officials to really take a step back and think about this and ponder what the possible repercussions of that could be on our economy and our transportation infrastructure here.
In James Wallace's case, he can't take a bus or rail. He's even investigated the rideshare program, but hasn't been able to find anyone who makes the same trip. In Wallace's case, driving alone is his only option.
We'd all would love to have a nice high-speed rail or at least even a low-speed rail to take away our dependence on having to purchase gas and all the expenses that go with that. It's very rough on my cars. I'll normally go through a car about every 2 years.
Indiana has the largest number of roads per capita, and as the crossroads of America, it's no surprise. We'll look at Indiana's infrastructure and the potential for growth of highways, railways, and public transportation systems as we put transportation in focus.
And joining us in studio tonight, our Indiana Transportation Association President, Marty Sennett, George Smirk, a professor emeritus with the Indiana University Kelley School of Business, and Bloomington State Representative Matt Pierce. Thanks to the three of you for being here. When the state leased the Indiana Toll Road a few years ago, we got about $4 billion, just a little less than $4 billion in one lump sum from that. And I'd like to get a response from each of you, and Matt, we'll start with you. Most of that money went towards the major moves road projects that Governor Daniels prioritized the money for. Was that focusing strictly, almost strictly on giving that money to road projects short-sighted, do you think?
Well, I certainly think it was, and I think the legislature has really shown a lack of vision when it comes to mass transit. It's very focused on roads. Part of that is because the road building industry has a very strong lobby, and those who want more roads built, roads improved and expanded, they're there every day pushing for that outcome. And what needs to happen is we need to have an even stronger support for mass transit. One of the other things is you have rural legislators who feel that mass transit doesn't have any impact for them. They think that's a big city thing, and therefore there's no reason for them to support it.
George, what do you think? What about focusing strictly a large amount of money on just roads instead of branching it out to other forms of transportation?
I don't think it was a good idea. First off, it wasn't as much money as there should have been. There's a professor at Notre Dame that said it should have been somewhere around $11 billion for that lease. Much more money to play with. Lord knows we could use improvements in highways, we could use improvements in a lot of things, but I think the money should have been spread around a little bit more. One thing, we keep hearing this high-speed rail thing. It would be nice just to have a decent bus service, then think about the rail a little bit later on. And I say that because if you come up with the premium first, it's very expensive. It's better off to start small and build.
Marty, your thoughts?
Well, I think we need to start looking at public transportation as a mode of transportation instead of a social service. It's a mode just like rail is, highways. It's got to be a complete balanced system with all the modes being funded, because not everybody fits into a certain pattern. Not everybody can drive a car.
Right.
We don't all have rail systems like they do in Northwest Indiana. So we have to find out where those folks fit in. In the last census that we talked about, car ownership, 9% of the people in Tippecanoe County did not have access to a car, and 30% only had access to one vehicle. So there's plenty of people out there that could benefit from having public transportation.
I think you bring up an interesting point, and that is that there are people for whom circumstances are difficult, but there's also a mental block, I think, in a lot of people's minds about the money it would cost to build out a transportation system, or whether they would use a train versus a bus versus a rideshare program. How do you think, and then we'll get responses from the other two of you, how do you think it is possible, if it's possible, to get past these mental blocks that seem to exist around public transportation?
Well, I think we have to do a better job of looking at alternative analysis. We always talk about subsidized public transit, but we never look at the roads, the amount of subsidy that we deal with roads. And when you figure out all the local dollars, the property tax dollars that go in after the road is built, and you start comparing the cost of the two, I think you'll find that public transit is very competitive in the modes of transportation.
Is that the sort of thing you would tell your students, George?
Yes, yes. I was thinking, as you talked there, Marty, I was thinking of the word intimidation, because I was reading some clippings today from the Northern Indiana Commuter Transportation District, the South Shore Line. And I was on the board of that railroad for 30 years. And our marketing director has a quote in his comments to the press saying that people feel intimidated. If you're not used to riding the train or the bus, whatever, what do I do? Where do I get on? And some education, some news, get the word out. It's really easy to get on the bus and go somewhere. It's really easy to get on a train and go somewhere. But get over that intimidation factor.
And Matt, what about in the Indiana General Assembly? You said the legislature has not responded very well. How would you get your colleagues in the legislature to take a more open view of all of the different possibilities that there exist for mass transit?
Well, I think that as with most things in the legislature, the people lead the legislature. We like to think we have all these statesmen that will, be forward-thinking and kind of lead the way, but in fact, we just respond to what our constituents want. And so you can see it beginning to develop now, some organization behind efforts to get the public engaged, to tell legislators we want better public transit in our communities, and that takes resources. I think one of the reasons why people are a little bit reluctant perhaps to use public transit if they don't have to is that we haven't capitalized the system enough to have them have schedules that are ultimately convenient. I lived and worked in Washington, D.C. for a long period of time, and you could just go into the metro and you knew that within 10 or 15 minutes at most, another train was going to come along. You never had to look at the schedule. You didn't have to think about transferring in any difficult way, and the system was always there. Now that takes a certain amount of money to make that happen, but I think that even a community like Bloomington, if you could have enough capital, enough buses, so you could have more lines, some more direct routes, I think you'd see a lot more people using the bus, even if they have a vehicle.
Well, with Washington, D.C., you're talking about a large population center, especially a large suburban area around Washington, D.C. You and I talked a couple of years ago about a study that was done talking about a rail line possibility from Bloomington through Indianapolis up to Muncie, and it seemed that one of the problems with the feasibility of that was going to be that that rail line, in order for it to be financially feasible, would have to wind through so many small communities as to make the timetable prohibitive for people to even want to ride this, because it suddenly would not be any faster than driving their cars, and in many cases would probably be slower even if it was more cost effective. I mean, how do you come across to people to say, look, we can find a balance between these things and we can get people over time to come to this idea that you don't have to drive your car everywhere?
Well, I think that what that study showed is you need to place these rail lines where most of the people are, and what they said is you have to go through these bedroom communities south of Indianapolis to pick up the ridership. Now, I think that you could definitely figure out a way to get the train moving fast enough that it would still be convenient. Because the other thing that people often forget is a time on a train can be very productive. I mean, you can do work, and we have Wi-Fi on these things now, and you can really get a lot of work done or just kind of relax. I'm a road warrior. I commute back and forth to Indianapolis every day when the legislature's in session, and you can get stuck in some traffic jams and you're just in the car. It's not very productive. And I often thought if I could, ride the rails from Bloomington to Indianapolis, I could get an awful lot of work done during that time.
George, I'd like to get a response from you and Marty on this. Let's talk about the economic development incentives that building out a train or a bus or even a rideshare system would have. What kind of impact would it have economically on central Indiana to be able to build out any sort of public transit system that goes intercity?
Well, the possibilities would be fantastic. Rail is particularly attractive because it looks like it's there and it's going to stay there. With the buses, people are not quite so sure. Well, the highways aren't going to be ripped up, but the bus doesn't always have to run on the highway. So where you have invested in rail transportation around the country, there's usually been quite a bit of development around the stations. In fact, even here in Indiana, if you go back in history, if you go south of Indianapolis, you'll find Stop 1 road, Stop 2 roads, Stop 8. Those were the stops on the Interurban Electric Railway that went down to Louisville. And if you look around those roads where the stop used to be, you'll find there's some older houses and businesses there. They were there 100 years ago, whenever line was developed. You can get development with bus service, too. We've seen it here in Bloomington because we have very extensive bus service. Maybe we could use more. But there's a lot of construction along those lines, especially aimed at students. And the knowledge that, hey, we build apartments here, we know we can get the students to the campus on the bus.
One of the good parts about my job is I get to travel around the country, and I see cities like St. Louis, Portland, that have light rail systems. And to see the development of the area, mixed use, condos, apartments, retail, office, it makes life a lot better for those who live in those areas because they're spending less time commuting. They can walk from one place to another, or they can take a short train ride to get to their office. And that frees up their time to do other things in life besides sit in a car.
I'm glad you brought up Portland as an example. One of the things we were talking about as we were researching this program is Portland, we were kind of joking, has really thrown everything they possibly can at the wall in terms of rail travel, bus travel, anything you could possibly have. It seems like Portland is a place you can find it. And I think perhaps as a consequence, Portland every year is ranked as one of the most livable cities in America. Is there a lesson that a place like in Indianapolis can take from the experiment that has gone on in Portland or places like it?
You have to have the will to want to do something. And whatever it is in Portland, they decided they were going to do this. San Diego did the same thing. And San Diegans, for whatever reason, have a strong will to get things done. They have one of the finest zoos in the world. They decided they're going to have a grade A transportation system, public transportation system. So they started the San Diego Trolley. And it's expanded and expanded. And at Portland, it's the same thing, same kind of approach, a strong will to do it. And then they figure out how.
We mentioned gas prices in our opening, and I think that, of course, that's the part of transportation that most people think about the most on a daily basis. I wonder if each of you gets a sense in your various walks of life that there has been a desensitization to the $4 a gallon gasoline this year that we did not see a couple of years ago when for the first time gas went over $4 a gallon and people said, whoa, I need to stop driving as much. This year, you heard Greg Sider from AAA say he doesn't necessarily expect that kind of reaction. So I wonder, are people becoming desensitized? Do we need $5 a gallon gas for people to be thinking about how they're going to change their habits this time around?
Personally, I don't think they have become desensitized, and I'll tell you why. In May, when those numbers were hitting $4.29 a gallon, our ridership went up about 17–18% just for that month. And that's with the university out of session for most of the month, so you can't say, well, it was all student riders. Now, these are town folks who decided, I can't afford to fill up my car, I'm going to look for an alternative. Now, a lot of these folks who are working at jobs that don't pay a whole heck of a lot, your service workers, food service, people who work in the big box lumber stores, they can't just buy a car at the drop of a hat because of their wages. And so when you look at the cost of the car, the gas, the insurance, and what they're earning, transit is a perfect alternative for that group of riders that we have.
George and then Matt, from an academic point of view and then from a legislative point of view, is there an argument to be made that $5 a gallon gas could be a good thing for the way transportation is viewed in Indiana?
Yes, and that's an idea that's been kicked around for several years, ever since we had the last big explosion in the price of fuel. It does wonderfully get people's attention. It's like knowing you're going to be hanged at midnight. You are aware of that fact. Yeah, it alerts people, and then when you start presenting alternatives, people may be more careful in looking through those alternatives. Should I ride on one of Marty's buses? Should I walk? Should I ride a bike or whatever? Those alternatives become more attractive. But that jolt doesn't hurt. Doesn't hurt at all.
How do you think, Matt, the tenor of transportation discussions at the State House would change if everybody was paying $5 a gallon for gas?
Well, it is an irony because it's terribly painful on people who don't have a lot of disposable income that can't absorb that additional cost. And so there are people out there that are really hurting on the lower end of the socioeconomic scale. But at the same time, from the kind of the broader public policy perspective, when people begin to say, I want to do something different where I don't have to pump all this expensive gas in my car, now you can build public support for other alternatives. And the economics, when you compare the cost of operating a first-class public transit system, becomes much different than when gas was $1, $1.50 a gallon.
While we're with you, and then we'll come back down the line, are there things the state could do, assuming people are not going to change their habits and that cars are going to be the way that people tend to travel? Are there changes the state could make to see that travel is either more economical or travel is made less of a burden on people if some of the other costs, like the cost of gasoline, continue to go up?
Well, I think there just has to be a fundamental change in the approach to the issue. For example, you look at Indianapolis, and the legislature is willing to throw all kinds of money at the bottleneck of I-69 and 465 on the northeast side of town. They'll add lanes and lanes and lanes. We'll be up to probably 25 lanes before we're done. And every time you add 2 lanes, the studies show that you take care of the problem for a little while, and then more people are kind of attracted to the open lanes, and then they become clogged up, and you've got to add more. What would happen if you decided, why don't we use some of that money to actually get a rail line or or some kind of express transit through that area. And maybe people would be willing to use that instead of taking and putting their car on those lanes. And I think you can have a better quality of life and actually a more efficient and economically viable transportation system if you take that approach.
George, what would you like to see the state do?
What Matt has suggested is good. I think they need to be more open to alternatives to highways. Such things as make it, for instance, have park and ride lots. If you're in the Seattle area, you drive south out of Seattle, there are park and ride lots all over. Park your car here, take the bus on into downtown Seattle. And they do the same thing with the rail lines too. Big parking lot, the state has money in it, local government has money in it.
And Seattle's just invested a large amount of money in its light rail right around
right. And the whole idea is intermodal. Drive your car part of the way and get on the bus or the train and go the rest of the way. No one thing will probably satisfy everybody's needs. But I think Seattle is a good example. I think it's, for some reason, Indiana cities don't want to seem to go out and look at Portland or Seattle and others and say, maybe we get some good ideas, or San Diego or whatever, get some good ideas there.
So Marty, it sounds like George would advocate vacations for people in Seattle. What would you have the state do?
Well, you know, we need to be, like Dr. Smirk said, we need to be more multimodal. When I was in his classes many years ago, he said Indiana is multimodal. We have cars and pickup trucks. But we need to look beyond that. We need to look at alternatives such as light rail, commuter rail, and strengthening our bus systems.
One thing we haven't talked about yet is that there are a number of smaller airports also in Indiana. Places like Fort Wayne and Gary and Evansville have worked to try to bolster their part in the air travel game in the last especially 5 to 10 years. Gary and Evansville have put a lot of time in trying to be bigger, better airports and trying to be seen less as regional hubs that are expensive to get into or out of. Is there a way that you can make rail travel, bus travel, air travel cooperate better? You just talked about intermodal, and this is something that's going on in Seattle. One of the reasons for the light rail line from downtown Seattle is it goes south into Tacoma to SeaTac Airport. Is this something that we can figure into as well to try to get people to airports and make it cheaper maybe to fly from Evansville to Indianapolis if you have a business meeting or something?
Well, remember years ago, maybe you don't remember years ago, but I do, we used to have regular air service here into Bloomington, between here and Chicago. Eventually to Chicago, it stopped at a couple places. But that's pretty expensive and the airline did not do well. So you think, wait a minute, we have a good highway that goes to the airport. That's kind of multimodal. You drive to the airport and then take the plane from there to San Francisco or whatever. Now, it doesn't make a great deal of sense to fly from Indianapolis to Chicago. That's a nightmare for airlines as well as for people having baggage fun.
Unless gas gets to be $7 a gallon.
And then maybe it's...
Then you might have the tipping point. But one of the things that our cities have failed at is in their design is we don't make the transportation seamless, where you can get off one mode onto another. Because you get to some of these smaller communities, you have to rent a car or have to go by taxi. And some of the better cities like San Francisco, Chicago, just get off the plane, you get onto the rail system, you're at the major cities in no time. And people like convenience. I think people are shying away from air travel because it's not convenient. Your planes break down, they get canceled, going through the screening is a hassle. So I would rather drive 5 to 10 hours than take a flight these days.
And that'll be $45 for that second bag.
Yeah, and the cost of flying these days is even more expensive than the cost of the gas and time to get there.
As I got to thinking about different modes of transportation for the show also, I thought about the private investment that's going on for space travel. Now, I wondered, what if you take that idea and you break it down to the local or the state level? Is there room, or is it even feasible, that there could be private investment, that you could have private bus companies that spring up, or some Bill Cook type who says, I want to invest $1 billion in a Bloomington-based or an Indianapolis-based rail system that just goes intra-city? Is this something that is possible, or is it cost prohibitive, or are there other prohibitions that would stop something like this from happening?
Well, it's possible, but when you do the figuring, you think, wait a minute, can I make money doing this? Providing any kind of transportation is expensive. We already said that. Everything is very expensive. And can you carry enough passengers at a reasonable fare, people feel is a reasonable fare for them, to make a buck on it? There's what, Megabus now, Marty? It's a private company, and you show up at a street corner and the bus comes, and if you're lucky, it's only $1 to go to Chicago or something like that. But so that's a private enterprise. Now they limit how many cheap tickets they have. And the airlines do the same thing in there with their, what do they call it, mileage? What is the word I'm trying to find out? Anyhow, it's those mileage programs.
Frequent flyer miles?
Frequent flyer, that's it.
Let me ask each of you in turn. Marty, we'll start with you and we'll go down the line. Are there problems facing transportation in Indiana that have not perhaps gotten as much notice, but are nonetheless underlying factors that stop transportation expansion and transportation feasibility in Indiana from being better than it is, that people don't necessarily know about?
Well, I think the underlying problem is, the thought is, will it pay for itself? We're the only government entity that is asked, or expected to pay for ourselves. I've yet to see a library pay for itself. I've yet to see a police department pay for itself. So I think this underlying thought that because it was once private, it should go back to that model, and that model has been dead for a long time.
George, underlying problems that you see that we need to deal with?
This feeling that if it doesn't make $1, it's not worth it. Now that's true all over the country, not just in Indiana. But the willingness to explore different ideas. I think the General Assembly can help in that. I think the local governments can help it. Let's look at all the possible options, the reasonable options, and then try to develop enough will to, okay, that looks like a good thing to do, let's go ahead and do it.
All right, and Matt, in 30 seconds, from the General Assembly's point of view, what are some of the things that you hear that maybe you raise an eyebrow at that you know need to be solved?
Well, there's an opportunity coming up because the legislature recognizes that because of the high cost of gas prices, people are getting more efficient vehicles, maybe going to electric cars and hybrids, and so the amount of money we're collecting from the gas tax is going down, and will probably keep going down, and that's the main funder that keeps all these roads going. And so a study committee, it's going to last several years, has been created, a Transportation Infrastructure Study Committee, and it's going to try to quantify what exactly are the problems and challenges we're facing in transportation in Indiana, and then what could be the solutions. And I think that's an opportunity maybe to change the mindset of the General Assembly about what makes sense going forward. All
right, well, my thanks to the three of you for being with us tonight. It's been enlightening for me, so thanks so much. Thanks to also the people who have watched and listened to this program tonight. Please do send us your questions or comments for next month's show to infocus@indiana.edu. You can also go to our website, that is indianapublicmedia.org/infocus. Have a nice night.
Production support for In Focus is provided by Hoosier Energy, providing electricity for Central and Southern Indiana electric cooperatives and their member customers. Information at hepn.com, and by viewers like you. Thank you.